what superpowers have you noticed emerge in your own lives as you've gotten older?
Just getting warmed up at 60 years old, the future is just this massive, creative outlet. It's like a blank slate, tabula rasa.
I haven't stopped progressing at all the things I wanted to progress at. I'm a better athlete at 55 than I was at 18. I'm a much better thinker, writer, husband, friend, all those things.
The last step you take to reach the pinnacle of Everest is just as important as the first step. Each step is crucial. So keep the vision of where you're going in mind and know that it's going to happen. And that way we can have the motivation and the grace to just bring 100% to everything we do every day.
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again, breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Stephen Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
I'm Dr. Tori Higgins. I'm the head coach at the Flow Research Collective, and I have the opportunity to moderate what's about to be a phenomenal conversation between 11-time best-selling author, founder, executive director of the Flow Research Collective, and one of the world's leading experts in human performance, Stephen Kotler. Stephen, hey, how are you?
Hey,
Welcome.
Everybody. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are.
Wherever you are. Yeah, all of the above. We're also joined by Mark Devine, who is an entrepreneur, New York Times bestselling author, philanthropist, and one of the world's top leadership and coaching experts. After a successful 20-year career as a Navy SEAL and SEAL commander, Mark was hired by the Navy to create a nationwide coaching and leadership program for the SEALs. That program was so effective, it's now being used outside of the Navy by top CEOs, Fortune 100 companies, USA Olympics, elite universities, just to name a few. Mark, great to have you here. Welcome.
Tori, thank you. Nice to see you. Stephen, nice to see you.
Always good to see you.
Amazing. We're going to take a deep dive today on how to conquer your fears of growing old. We're going to be talking about how to fight back mental and physical fragility, as well as how to make what years you have left the most fulfilling yet, and so much more. So, Stephen, to kick ass before you kick the bucket, use a term that's new. Most people talk about successful aging. You're talking about peak performance aging. What is that? What's peak performance aging?
So I don't think it's anything fancy. I've always said peak performance is nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. And that's not even my definition. I'm just putting a modern spin on something William James said 100 years ago. But peak performance aging follows from that, which is getting our biology to work for us rather than against us when applied to the opportunities and challenges of aging. So that's how I think of it. But successful aging, healthy aging, adaptive aging, like all those titles, what I was interested in finding a way that we don't get dead before we're dead. That was what I was interested in. And if you go into like the field that is peak performance aging, the people who are sort of working on the upper end of the spectrum, I think that's sort of, nobody says it like that, but successful aging, healthy aging, adaptive aging is about a lot about well-being, happiness, and overall satisfaction in our later years. And I think peak performance aging is much more about kicking ass till you kick the bucket, continuing to go after impossible challenge, hard challenge, hard challenge, hard challenge. And that's how I think of the difference. There's, we can get more scientific from that, but like that's a general look at the difference in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's huge. What does peak performance aging mean to you, Mark? What's that look like for you?
Well, aging, to me, I agree with a lot of what Stephen says, but I think there's also an element of grace involved. It really is going to depend a lot on what your just kind of your makeup is, like your soul force, your genetic makeup, that's going to kind of determine what kind of challenges that you're going to go after. So not everyone is inclined to go become a park skier in their 50s, or not everyone's going to be jumping out of airplanes flying at 30,000 feet when they're 75, 80 years old. But there are other ways that they can challenge themselves, and a lot of it might be spiritual challenge, might be emotional challenge, it might be some more integrative challenge. And so I look at aging in terms of wholeness and integration, and trying to ever becoming more and more complete as a human being. And if we could do this gracefully and in balance, which includes bringing our bodies along for the ride and not letting them go. And I think this is where Stephen's work is really important. It's like, and our work with Unbeatable Mind is really important. It's like, we bring the body along and we put it at the front, because the body is the vessel that we experience life through. And so I look at the mind body as one entity. And so they are both meant to be trained to be optimized. And that's a lifelong process. It's a lifelong journey of becoming more whole, more complete, regardless of your age. The way you experience the body, or I should say, the way the body experiences life itself, is going to change every decade. And it's going to be different. And it's going to be different based upon the type of person. It's going to be different based upon your age, your capabilities, and your interests. So I think putting it all together, peak performance aging means to me is to optimize gracefully based upon your uniqueness. How would you want to show up, and who you want to show up as. And I do think there's so much potential that is just left behind by the average individual who just doesn't understand the power of the mind to train the body, the power of the body to perform, extraordinary things. And because we've kind of been dumbed down as humans in our culture. So time to smarten up.
Truly. So there's so many things that you just said that I want to unpack. So let's do one at a time. So first of all, you're talking about exploration and the importance of, so growing and learning, it doesn't mean just in one way, right? You're talking spiritually, mentally, physically. Stephen, it makes me think of a part in Gnar Country. We talk about the importance of openness to experience. So it feels very tied to what Mark was just saying. Based on your research of peak performance aging, how important is maintaining this openness to experience?
It's a cool question, because it's really important, and it's important in a couple of different ways. Creativity increases in our 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s because the two halves of the brain start working together in really new ways. But to take full advantage of it, if we're closed to experience, if we're closed to novelty, we're going to shut down sort of the natural superpowers of aging. And if we get too shut down, they did a whole bunch of work where they wanted to look at the big 5 personality traits, of which openness to experience is one, and their relationship to healthy longevity and things like that. And while everything was sort of related a little bit, openness to experience, they saw when openness to experience takes a sharp decline, within a year, you see cognitive decline. So if we're interested in, training up the brain, which we can do to stave off cognitive decline, it seems like doesn't really matter what we do to train that up. If we lose our openness to experience, it's going to take us the same place we were trying to avoid. So I think it's really crucial, sort of on every level. Plus, I think life gets pretty stale without it, pretty fast. Just on a simple human soul level, like without openness to experience, you better really love your routine.
100%. I think that's a theme throughout Gnar Country, is the benefits of this open new experience and how that fuels a journey of lifelong learning, which really flies in the face of the long, slow rot theory, right? You call total BS on that in the book, and really highlight how so many important skills are use it or lose it. So can you talk a little bit about that, Stephen? Because I know you just touched on lifelong learning and the importance of that as well, Mark.
So the old idea, right, is that our mental skills and our physical skills, they decline over time. And there's nothing we can do to stop the slide. And we spent most of the last century really proving that out, right? We found all the different ways the brain and the body declines over time. And then starting around 1995 or so, a bunch of studies started showing up where, hey, wait a minute, VO2 max, for example, which we used to believe fell off a cliff and there's nothing we can do. Now it turns out it's totally trainable, and 80-year-olds can have the VO2 max of like 35-year-olds if they're training it properly. And it's same thing with fast twitch muscle response, strength. There are certain things that are going to decline over time a bit, but like not nearly as much as we thought. And like, for example, strength, we'll lose 30% of our strength over time, but or our muscle fibers, but the fibers that remain learn how to do way more work. So we've lost 30% of our strength, but it only translates to like a 15% loss over time if you're properly trained, which is pretty spectacular considering all the gains you make in wisdom and expertise and those sorts of things that kind of work around that. But it's really across the board. It's all our cognitive skills, all our physical skills, a lot of it. And the weird part was some of this stuff has to be trained in very odd ways. Dr. Adam Ghazali, who's at the University of California, San Francisco, has built video games that specifically train and target, and they're all approved by the FDA and as medicines, but they train and target different losses of cognition. So task switching or focus and attention, et cetera, et cetera. And, who would have thought, and they're very flowy video games. They're built based on a challenge skill, very tight challenge skill feedback loop. And it's sort of a closed loop system, and it gets phenomenal results. But like, some of this stuff you train the way, you train strength by lifting heavy weights, you train stamina by trying to run far and run fast kind of thing. But some of the stuff with the brain, you have to train that way. And some stuff is weird, like our hippocampus, which does long-term memory, shrinks over time. How do you fight that? Exercise. Exercise increases hippocampal volume and neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So figuring out how to train the various aspects was complicated, but we now know that pretty much everything that declines over time is a use it or lose it skill, and we can hold on to it and even advance it far later in life than anybody thought possible.
It's a huge discovery. So, Mark, you were just talking about the importance of lifelong learning for you as well. So how does this truth of use it or lose it land for you?
Well, it's a truth with a capital T. And, my experience in life has been heavily influenced, obviously, by my Navy SEAL days, my Navy SEAL training. Also, I've been a practitioner of yoga for probably more than 20 years and the martial arts for over 30 years. And you can look at yoga and martial arts as a developmental path or practice, both of them. And that look at the human being as something that, as an entity that can be trained and evolved with deliberative effort, using certain practices and tools and methodologies, following certain protocols that when done with a disciplined daily effort can literally keep the body in extraordinary health for very, very long periods of time. And there are many, many kind of off the record accounts of martial artists who lived to 200-300 years old, and yogis who lived even longer. And you find these accounts, riddled throughout Eastern texts and writings and through, just kind of lore. You don't find that much in the Western world because people, objective science kind of poo-poos all that stuff as kind of bullshit, right? But so you have to kind of be a study of N=1 to really get to that level of truth. So back to where I'm going with this. So when I was in my early 20s, I was a competitive athlete in college. It was largely because I wanted to get the heck away from my family, which was a little chaotic. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about the power of forgiveness and love for longevity as well, because all that stuck energy is gonna corrode you from the inside out. So I found a lot of bliss and joy running in nature, in wilderness, right up in the Adirondack Mountains, and swimming in the lakes up there, and a lot of that alone. And I found great solace in that. That was kind of very healing for me. Nature was really my first guru. And then that led to competitive sports at Colgate University. And then when I got to my first career in Manhattan as getting my MBA at NYU and working to become a CPA and then a consultant, there was I obviously had a radical shift in my environment, right? And we know that environment will affect you dramatically, but the people you're around and the place, because it affects the experience. So suddenly my experience went from I'm living in upstate New York and I'm running and swimming and I'm in nature to I'm in this concrete jungle and I'm putting a suit on every day and I'm riding the subway and I'm sitting in a cubicle. And what here I'm 21 years old, and what I hesitate to use the word soul, but what came to me, right? Just some knowingness that was not cognitive, wasn't something I read in a book. So it wasn't knowledge. It was a knowingness. This knowingness came to me and said, Mark, do not stop training. If you stop training, then everything will start to unravel eventually. Right. And I had this sense that there's this outflowing of life that lasts until, of energy that lasts until you're in your, late 20s. And then everything starts turning around. Late 20s, maybe late 30s can be different. And then everything starts turning around then it goes backwards with inertia. But I had this sense that if I kept training, then that wouldn't be the case. Like you can kind of hack the natural outflowing then inflowing of the life force. Right. And that leads to what people consider normal aging. So I decided at that moment when I was 21 to just continue training every opportunity I had every day. So I trained in the morning through a run. I came back, stretched, I meditated. At lunchtime, I went to the gym when all my peers went and did I did a high intensity workout. They went and had a big burger. And in the evening before I went to NYU, which is down at the old World Trade Center, I had a couple hours, break. And that's when I found martial arts, and that led me to Zen meditation, right? And so all of that happened in 1 year when I shifted my environment from, college to this school. And so there was this massive, just push into this new way of living where instead of being told what to do by a coach in an athletic endeavor, I was trusting my instincts, and my instincts were saying, Mark, you got to train. And not just train, but train every day in a disciplined manner. And you got to train in a way that covers your entire system. And this is where the martial arts really started to influence me, and Zen meditations. Like you're not training if you're just training your body. You got to train your body. You got to train your mind. You got to train your emotions. And later on, you got to train your intuition. And you got to train even to tap into your deeper powers of insight and understanding of why you're on this planet. All of that comes through an integrated practice of daily developmental work, right? So now to kind of pull back from that, we know from Carol Dweck's work, fixed mindset, 95% of humanity really is kind of stuck in a fixed mindset, which means that they believe that they are who they are, they're not going to change, and there's not a damn thing they can do about it. So they just kind of ride things out, and life is what it is. Life happens to them. And then you have everyone on this broadcast who is in a growth mindset. And those are individuals who have had the sense that they actually are becoming something more than what they are. What they are right now is not the whole of it. And it's just this inner sense that they have. And so they decide they're going to do something about it. And that leads them to personal and self-development. It leads them to yoga. It leads them to park skiing, whatever. And so they start to do something about it. Now, what we're trying to say here, I think, Stephen and I, is that in the doing something about it, there's a certain way that you can optimize that experience of growth that you so desire. And it is in a multidimensional manner, right? And so this is the lost secret to personal development. And really what we pioneered with Unveiled Mind is that when you develop in a multidimensional manner, in an integrative manner, meaning like we train what I call the 5 mountains every day, physically, mentally, emotionally, intuitionally, and spiritually. And we weave those even into our workouts. And even if we're going to go skiing, or even we're just going to go out in nature, we look at it from that perspective. We say, what are we doing to improve the body-mind system in a physical, mental, emotional, intuitional, spiritual way? And what happens is you unlock this unbelievable vertical development, right? Where you evolve, you become more whole, you become more inclusive, more compassionate. You take greater perspective. You have this massive outwelling of care and concern. It's really quite extraordinary. So I know I went a little bit kind of long-winded on that, but that's my take on lifelong development. Right? It needs to be integrative. It needs to be daily, disciplined. And when you take responsibility for your growth this way, then you unlock this really kind of rapid growth. And your body comes along for the ride. It gets healthier and healthier as you age.
And I think you're hitting on so many key things though, because I'm asking about, my question was around, what are your thoughts on use it or lose it, and this journey of being a lifelong learner throughout your entire life. And I think your integrative approach is very much in alignment with what Stephen's talking about in his Gnar quest. as well. And I think that really what I hear from both of you is advocating for just this higher level of intentionality around how you're living the second half of your life. And one of the kind of key things that jumped out at me, Mark, that Stephen, I was dying to ask you about too, is this piece of authenticity. You're talking about a knowingness and knowing yourself and following your instincts and tuning into yourself, your emotional, physical, mental needs, right? And this is so a key piece of the Gnar quest, right? So Stephen, can you talk about how do you prioritize authenticity in your life? What role did it play, or what role does it play in peak performance aging?
So, sort of one of the ideas inside of Gnar Country is that it is incredibly helpful to have a mission in the second half of your life, right? My mission was to learn to park ski. It was an incredibly challenging physical activity that was supposed to be impossible for folks over 50 to learn. But more importantly, I had unfinished business. I had, I was an old school punk rocker from the Midwest, and I didn't like the jocks, and the jocks didn't like me. And like in the Midwest, in the Ohio of my childhood, if you had funny hair, like football players would pull their cars over and 5 guys with baseball bats would jump out to beat you up because you had a mohawk. That was Monday in Ohio, right? So like I had a grudge towards athletes, and we know this is kind of funny and weird, but we know we're going to get to this topic later. So let's start now. Forgiveness of self and others is really important for successful aging, peak performance aging, all of it. And I didn't quite know how to put down those earlier issues. Loving kindness meditation is very effective for forgiveness, but it wasn't a big enough tool for sort of that one. And so I designed a Gnar style quest. Mine was park skiing. My point here, we'll come back to the forgiveness stuff, but my point here is that you want a mission, and it's got to be something of an authentic mission. If for no other reason, we get a huge boost in energy and motivation when things are very much authentic. We improves mental health, physical health, bunch of kind of emotional factors for peak performance aging. And what I like about authenticity is authenticity, there's no such thing as your authentic self. The self is an evolving, changing thing. So there's only authenticity is a verb. It's a way of acting, right? It's a tight link between your values, your self-concept, and your actions, but it shows up through action. You get a whole bunch of sort of really, and Scott Barry Kaufman, who we did a previous podcast, actually did a lot of work on this, but authenticity, if you can get this right and get yourself on, design this authentic style mission that I think is really crucial for peak performance aging, it correlates with vitality. So Mark sort of hinted at that in what he was just talking about, right? And when you get this fully integrated, very authentic sort of approach to life going, you get more vitality. And that definitely shows up in the science as well. You end up with an internal locus of control, right? Which gives you a greater sense of control for forces. That matters for peak performance aging. A sense of control is a really positive emotion. Positive emotions amplify the production of T cells and natural killer cells. So the cells that fight diseases and the cells that fight tumors and other sick cells show up when we generate really positive emotions, and a sense of control is one of those. And it's easier to get that sense of control when your mission is sort of authentic. You get less self-alienation and less anxiety and depression and more well-being and self-esteem. And when you're authentic, to go back to an earlier topic, it's also easier to be open to experience because you're on mission. So like whatever is coming in seems like more appropriate, and we're more open to it. And we know how that is. I also think that the thing about authenticity that's important is we know, whether it's peak performance aging or successful aging, living with passion, purpose, and regular access to flow really matters. And being authentic tends to correlate with more passion, purpose, flow, curiosity, all these things. So I think of it as like it's a multi-tool. It solves a bunch of different problems we want to solve. But the final thing, and the last thing, and where I started with the Gnar style quest, is a Gnar style quest. Mine was park skiing. Yours could be anything. It's just a challenge and impossible that you want to go after, but it's hard. It's hard work. And you need all the motivation you can get. You want to stack motivators, right? Athletes never just rely on a single physical fuel, right? You got carbs and fats and et cetera, and hydration and all that stuff. You want to do the same thing with emotional fuels. And Carl Rogers, the psychologist, the human psychologist, talked about authenticity as sort of a fundamental drive. And so when a fundamental drive means lots of motivation. So in an authentic style quest, you get a whole bunch of extra motivation, which, sort of does a lot of the hard work for you. And so I think it's super important. And I think it's one of the main reasons it's important, because Mark and I are in agreement, is you want to train the whole person. There's a lot to do, right? There's a lot to do, and it's some work. And sort of the difference between being young and being old is when you're young, you can sort of get away with not quite doing it. When you're old, if you're not moving forward, you're going backwards. So there's a lot to do. You have to do it, and you're going to need that extra fire, as far as I can tell. And an authentic quest, an authentic mission, an Gnar style quest that's really tied to authenticity, you're just going to get farther faster with a lot less fuss. And bonus, your life will feel way more meaningful, right? That's as an added bonus, right? Your life will also feel more meaningful. So I talked for a little bit too long there, and I apologize. Captain long-winded over here, but over to you, Tori.
Following my lead.
No, I think that you're highlighting, though, just the countless benefits of dialing in an authentic quest for yourself later in life, right? That's really what is required to align your intrinsic motivators and tap into that limitless fuel source, right? And side bonus, you're going to be, purpose driven and feel more fulfilled, right? So it occurs to me, though, as you're talking, and both of you are in the business of training leaders, right? Both at Unbeatable Mind and the Flow Research Collective. There's a certain part of our life where many people, because they're doing whatever they need to climb the corporate ladder, disconnect from that authentic self. So for people that were just listening to that sounds amazing. What are your thoughts on how to train leaders to tap into that authenticity, to get more of that in their lives? How do you even set about starting to construct your own, Gnar quest? What are your thoughts on that first, Mark?
I'll be 60 in July.
I'm 55.
Feeling good, looking good, how to be in Hollywood. Stronger now and healthier probably than I was in my 20s, because, back to what you were saying, even though I was training, I wasn't, back in my 20s, I wasn't doing it as wisely as I am now. And I wasn't eating as well, I wasn't sleeping as well, I was drinking too much. I was training like a madman with the SEALs, but I guarantee you I am way healthier and actually stronger in many ways now, because of the integrated nature of the training and my flexibility, my durability, my resiliency. All of these things have gone through the roof. I may not be able to do as much on a deadlift, but make up for it in other ways. So you're absolutely right. And I have this saying, if you're not training yourself, someone else is training you, right? And so inertia, if you're not training your body, inertia is training it. It's basically dysregulating it, and it's going to, send it south quickly. And if you're not training your mind, then your mind is being trained by society, culture, TV, social media, the people who are trying to shape your mind literally to their needs. And so it's very, very important that you train your mind relentlessly every day. But it doesn't have to be hard. Neither does physical training. This is another thing. I'll get back to your question. None of this, the idea of Gnar Country doesn't have to be gnarly. It actually is quite fun. And that's part of, getting back to authenticity, is to, when you can get clear around what your purpose is, right? For me, purpose is never about doing, it's about being. It's an archetypal energy, right? And it also might be tied to, some of the conditions for either how you either randomly showed up in this world, or whether your belief is that you chose this life, right? You came in to learn certain lessons, which created, some traumas, which led to things like what Stephen was talking about. Like, he had a distaste for people like me because they beat him up. Well, that led to a lifelong kind of urge to overcome that childhood trauma, right? That early wound, which led him to constantly seek extreme challenges to feel more whole, like to feel more complete, and to erase that wound. So that led to an archetypal kind of sense of purpose and drive, right? And that gave you that motivation. So everyone has these things, and it's incumbent upon us to sit quietly. There's two ways to find them. One is to have someone point them out to you, and the other is to just sit and watch your life and say and ask, what is the energy of my life? What are the big rocks, right? What the yogis call the samskaras that keep showing up, right? And take a look at those, and don't run from them, but pull them right out and put them in front of you and say, all right, sucker, I'm going to go after you. I'm going to solve this once and for all. And how do I solve it? Well, you got to build some courage. How do you build courage? You got to starve the fear. How do you starve fear? You stare at that problem and you inch your way toward it, right? You set up some goals. You say, I'm going to overcome this. If I'm going to learn how to parachute, free fall parachute, then I'm not going to just throw a parachute on my back and go up and jump out of an airplane, right? You talk about crawl, walk, run, Stephen. We do that in the SEALs all the time. That's like going from zero to sprint. You don't do that. Not only is it terrifying, you'll probably kill yourself. So what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what's the smallest arc toward that thing which scares the shit out of me. And I'm going to go learn that. I'm going to find the book. I'm going to find the person. I'm going to watch the videos. And I'm going to set the goal just to do that one tiny thing. And we had a saying in the SEALs, doubt's eliminated through action. So you take that action, your doubt is eliminated. Fear is eradicated because you've turned away and you moved courageously toward overcoming just that small thing. And then you do the next, and you link these things in a daisy chain toward that gnarly goal that you have, which is what you actually fear, which is usually tied towards some sort of trauma in your life or something that you don't feel complete or whole with. And this process actually develops great authenticity because you're living in alignment with your archetypal purpose, and you're doing the work of your shadow self, right? Which means you're going to be showing up every day you do this, so you're going to be showing up as more authentic to your team. Because after all, that's what authenticity is. It's like you're showing up as more whole. You're taking the mask off. You're showing up with your team, not claiming the perfection to be the perfect person or the absolute authority. You're showing up as a human being with all of his flaws and all the, realizations that you're the same as everyone else. You just happen to have leader role for today. And that develops great trust. And then from trust, you can get to respect. So courage, trust, and respect are the three elements that really create the most effective leadership and team bonding. And leaders are often the blocking force in a great team because they don't show up courageously facing their fear, staring down their wolf of, fear, I call it.
Mark raised a point saying, hey, this doesn't have to be hard work. And in fact, the argument that I make is you want a deliberate play, not a deliberate practice approach to learning. Yes. Deliberate practice is repetition with incremental advancement, right? Both Mark and I agree that you want to go 1 inch at a time. You want to go slow, one doubt at a time, but we're both in total agreement on that. But deliberate practice is great for learning certain kind of skills. And even if there's a big, hard skill that you're learning, there may be one or two elements where you want a deliberate practice approach where you're like, okay, this is the really scary thing. So I'm going to do it over and over and over again to get it perfect. But in general, deliberate play, which is repetition without repetition or repetition with improvisation. You do the same thing you just did and you improvise in a fun, interesting, curious, exploratory way on top of it, just a little bit. But what's cool about that approach is we know from a tremendous amount of research, and I think this sort of aligns with Mark's archetypal ideas, that we have authentic play styles and it emerges organically, right? One of the things about authenticity that is interesting is it's sort of like style in art, for example, in writing. When you're younger in your 20s, you try to copy like the 10 people that you love the most, right? You try to learn how to write. In the beginning, your style is actually your bad appropriation of these people you love blended together, right? And it's totally authentic because nobody's going to love these 10 same people the way you do, and nobody's going to get it wrong or right in the exact way you do. And then your own style sort of emerges out of this mashup thing that you've done. But one, it's very helpful to be playful with that because otherwise you're just trying to like be better than James Joyce or something as a writer. And that's a big cross to bear, right? It's a little easier to be playful in that way. But I like this idea of an authentic play style because it allows just for way more experimentation and freedom. and degrees of freedom. And that's when I think about the deliberate practice versus deliberate play, and then I'll shut up. That thing I want to point out that I think is really cool. Deliberate practice, there's only one right answer. I did the thing I did last time and just moved it a little. I did, like, that's the one right answer. With deliberate play, there's only one wrong answer, which is I did the same thing I did last time. Everything else is a right answer. And that's interesting because when we get things right in that way, we get little bursts of dopamine, and that's motivation and momentum, and incredibly useful, and it feeds on itself.
I think that that's an incredibly important distinction to make, though, between deliberate practice and deliberate play, because to Mark's point, this can look a lot of different ways. And I have to say this because this is actually an opportunity for me to quote my favorite part of the book, Stephen. So I love the fact that, what you're talking about is just this extreme intentionality in your approach to training and embarking on learning a new thing, right? It doesn't always have to be hard. Sometimes it should be fun. Sometimes it should be hard. Sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's not, right? But it's all by design. And it just struck me as you were talking, Mark, that there's a part in the book where Stephen's training, right? Trying to up his physical strength for the Gnar quest when he could get on skis. And, the first few days of training ended up being too easy, right? And you talk about, it wasn't even a snack. Let's keep going. And it was like, you had to pull yourself back. And I think if people are wondering what this actually looks like, Gnar Country is actually a play-by-play of what this journey looks like. This is an experiment in peak performance aging, and you kind of go through the ups and downs of sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, and there's a challenge sometimes in your mindset to pull yourself back from the edge or to stop yourself from going too far, right? So I want to double click on a key piece that we haven't gone to yet, which is courage. Mark, you just started talking about it. So, Stephen, one of your rules in Gnar Country is never stop at the top. Hesitation is never your friend. And it feels like courage is a big piece of that. So how does courage play a role in peak performance aging? How do you maintain it?
To me, just coming off never stop at the top, which is actually something I learned from Ryan, and it's a terrain park thing. Most people ski into a terrain park and they stop and they survey the field and then decide what they're going to do. And that does three terrible things. One, it destroys momentum, right? A body in motion has more possibilities than a body at rest. And vision and what are known as affordances, which are, when we look at objects, we don't see objects. We see what are known as affordances or opportunities for action. And a body moving, looking at a ski jump, take whatever it is, has way more opportunities for action. So there's way more possibility. The possibility space is much, much bigger, but also stopping at the top. All you're doing is opening the door for fear and just letting it in. And, this is an action sports example, but, I talked about this a lot in The Art of Impossible, and it seems to distinguish. So there's one of the things that distinguishes most peak performers, which is most peak performers have a lean in instinct, meaning like a challenge arises. Most people dither. They think about it, or even if they're going to step to the challenge, they'll walk away for 5 minutes first. And I've seen a lot of peak performers, the challenge shows up and they immediately lean in, and they're doing it because they know they're going to do it anyways. And fear only builds up in that pause. You're only making it harder for yourself. So oftentimes, really, it's often a question of, do I want to be a little uncomfortable right now or really uncomfortable later? When you do the analysis that way, no, I'll take a little uncomfortable now. So those are a lot. And the funny thing about courage is, this was a really hard thing for me to understand. I didn't understand as a child that I thought courageous people didn't feel fear. I didn't realize that courage meant, no, you're scared to death. You just do the thing anyways. If somebody would have told me that earlier, I probably would have done a lot better as a child, right? It took me a really long time for me to be like, oh, everybody feels this bad on the inside. It's just about what I do next. And that was easier than because feeling like a coward on the inside, I spent decades beating myself up over that one. And once I realized that everybody feels that way on the inside, it's just what you do with it and what you do next that solves for that. That was a huge breakthrough for me, I have to say. So I don't know. That was a little bit all over the place, but I think those are all points worth making.
100%. Mark, what about you? I know this is a huge theme in your books too. I love that you talk about, um, staring down your fear. The fear wolf resides in the head. The courage wolf resides in the heart, and the wolf that you feed the most is the one that's going to dominate your behavior. So can you expand on that?
Of course, yeah. There's lots of ways to look at fear. One of them is, this kind of metaphor of the two wolves. Fear generally, there's two types of fear. There's the imaginary fear, and then there's actually real fear. Like real fear is I'm careening toward a cliff in my car, and there's no guardrail. Like, okay, you're going to feel existential fear, and that's normal. And that's, for a purpose, is right. It's to really jack your system into overdrive with the fight or flight, and to give you access to a little bit of potential resources which you might not otherwise have. In the case of the careening car, it's probably not going to do you much good. So, there you go. That's real fear. The rest of fear really is imaginary, meaning it's in our head, right? It's something, it's like the burnt rope or the rope as a snake kind of metaphor, right? You open the door to the garage and you see a snake and you're scared shitless and floods you with all the same hormonal responses, adrenaline, epinephrine, all the fear-based stuff. And, you run and you get your friend and he comes back and with a flashlight, and you open it up and you point the flashlight and you see it's just a coiled rope. So in that case, much of fear, which resides in our head, the way our brain processes information and creates a reality inside our mind, is based upon a false expectation or false evidence. So those are great acronyms to remember what fear, is or is not. It's a false expectation or false evidence that appears as real. Investigate it. So you're going to have, when you come against one of these things where you have that reaction, and it's not an abject like existential crisis, because you're not careening toward that cliff, or you know what I mean, there's no tiger chasing you. It really is just something that you're making up in your head. Then pause. In the SEALs we say pause, breathe, think, and then act. Don't just react. So pause, breathe, right? So the pause in itself interdicts the response. The deep diaphragmatic breathing, nostril breathing, massages the vagus nerve, gets that parasympathetic nervous system counteracted, and it starts to calm you down. And now you're like, oh, it opens up that space where I can kind of like shine the light. Is that a snake or is that a rope? And so that's the thinking part. And so now when it comes to thinking, this is where the courage work comes in. So if you're stuck in your head and you're looping around with this fear, it's generally something that has been patterned over a long period of time, right? Like back to Steve's example of the bullies, right? So anytime Steve sees a car with 5 jocks in it coming up behind him, he's probably patterned, but goes spin into that fear, whether it's real or not. They might not even notice him, right? So we all have these conditioned patterns, and I call them fear loops, which is just the programming of the brain/mind. And so when we get stuck in those, we're dead, right? They just lead us, and they continue no matter what you do. Even if you got that breathing practice and you're doing all the things that I'm saying, you're still going to get re-triggered and reactivated. So you've got to learn to interdict those. And we have a process I teach called the WIRM process, WIRM. You witness it happening. Now, witnessing it happening means you got to do some practice to become more aware. This is like the work of mindfulness. Become aware when you get triggered into those fear loops. And then you interdict it with a powerful, positive internal dialogue and even some imagery. You can look at yourself as a warrior, like blasting it with a lightning bolt, or, you're like, no, not now. I'm not having this. This is the first part of the think part. I'm not having this fear-based. What is it then? Now what we do is we feed courage. Now, courage is from the heart. The heart doesn't have that same patterning. It's a different type of brain, right? It really is the source of your wisdom rather than your intellect, your cleverness. So cleverness, it veers toward negative. Science says that we're 5 times as negative as we are positive because we're stuck in our head and with those fear loops, and it's all that conditioning that society, culture, family, church, everything is placed upon us. So what we do is we deliberately get into our heart, and that means we drop our awareness into our heart, we open it, we ask courage, right? What it is that we need to do now, right? We ask courage, right? How do we move forward toward this? So it's the way this works out. Okay, it's correct what Stephen says, that everybody truly experiences fear, even Navy SEALs, right? The first 200, and even today, if I went and parachute jump, free fall jump, I'm going to experience that kind of raw fear because I'm hurling myself out of this airplane with a parachute that hopefully will open on my back. And so we'll pause into that fear, and I look at it, and I breathe, right? So I'm massaging the vagus nerve, I'm breathing into it, and then I'm interdicting that fear response with a powerful, courageous statement. And that is going to be an internal derived statement. I've got this, easy day, piece of cake. I've trained for this. I've done hundreds of jumps. It's going to be fine. And then I just keep that internal dialogue going. And in this sense, now what we're doing is we're beginning the process of transmuting the energy or the sensations of fear that we relate to the experience, right? Because it's just a physiological experience that I, in my mind, relate to impending doom. So I start to reframe how my mind experiences that energy, and I transmute it into commitment, into determination, right? Into excitement even. And so in this way, the more you do something, and this goes back to kind of deliberate practice and play, the more you practice something in a reality-based way, meaning where what you're practicing is really as close to the real thing as possible. And the more you do that while transmuting this energy of fear into courage and into commitment and determination, because it's aligned with your purpose, your why, then the more exciting it actually becomes. Mm. And then the more play you can introduce into it, right? Same scenario, but you're experiencing it now as excitement, right? And the energy, you can really harness the energy for performance, and it doesn't debilitate you anymore.
Stephen, so, I mean, this all sounds it sounds like you have a very similar approach, honestly, to dealing with this fear response and transfer, converting it into courage in the moment. Stephen, what were some of the strategies you used for this when you were on skis, learning to park ski?
So I'm just going to talk about a weird one that I sort of stumbled onto. There were a couple, but one of them was, so I am prone to vertigo. It was inner ear damage that came after I had Lyme disease, and I'm naturally afraid of heights. And then I suddenly became prone to vertigo. And as a skier, especially in the big mountain environments, when I'm above exposed cliffs, that's already a scary place to be. But when the world starts spinning and, you get all the other things with vertigo. So like muscle control goes and strength goes, all that stuff goes. It's a bad situation. And, I've been sort of, it's been sort of a lifelong, I don't let it stop me from doing what I do, but I have found that I have to be sort of more cautious with certain things, because I can literally put myself in a bad situation and then make it 1,000 times worse. Right. So, and it was very frustrating, especially in the Gnar Country. And so at one point I was above exposed cliffs. I was with Ryan. He can testify to this one. And I was so frustrated. I sort of roared. I just shouted and roared. Well, suddenly roaring, as any martial artist will tell you, who kias, produces testosterone. And testosterone brought muscle control back online and pushed sort of the vertigo away. And so I discovered that, like, in moments of extreme fear, I could literally shout at the fear and then take the testosterone that resulted and use it to get me moving. So, like, I had, there were a whole bunch of techniques. The thing that I agree with every single thing Mark has said. And, but the question is always, if you're dealing with fear on a 1 to 10 scale, most people, you want to start to regulate it when it's at a 1, because by around 5, now it's probably too big. Right. And, Mark's, and I like what Mark was doing, where he's combining breath work with a reframing, like his warrior reframing practice. There's a lot of stuff in there. That's the toolkit you want to go after. But once you're above 5, you're into a whole different bunch of physiology. And so you need slightly different tools there. Roaring was one of the ones that actually worked for me, and surprising. And, trust me, it's when you're like with a group of people and you're the one who's scared, and what you have to do is roar to like fight back that fear. It's just as embarrassing. So you're not going to be spared the shame and embarrassment. You're just going to be able to push through it. And I think we're both interested in the same thing, which is like, how can you fear is wonderful as a motivator. If it doesn't get control of you, it gives you focus for free. Anything that gives you focus, brain uses most of our energy, and most of the brain's energy budget goes for paying attention to things. And if you're getting focus for free, whether it's curiosity or passion or purpose or fear, like, it's a big deal. You're actually saving energy, right? Fear tends to counteract it, because if you're going to ride that adrenaline feeling and that norepinephrine feeling, you're going to like lose the energy. You're going to expend the energy that you got from the focus for free. So you have to be able to, use it, harness it for focus, and then sort of dissipate the after effects, which I think Mark and I are in total agreement that, like, breathing, reframing, and if that doesn't work, try shouting. It works.
Roaring. Roaring. Call it what it is, Stephen. Roaring. Yeah.
But the larger point is that our emotions are tools, right? They're tied to their physiology. They're tied to our neurobiology. And Mark's point is well, if we don't train them, they're going to train us. Right. Mm-hmm. You don't just get to be passive. It's one or the other. So you've got them. They're either going to run roughshod over your life, or you're going to get some control of them. And if you get some control of them, they start to be tools, and that are like it's much more fun to be like pulling on anger in a scary situation that you put yourself in as a tool than, pulling on that sort of thing. And it starts to let you work with some of those harder, more Mark's shadow side, right? The more complicated emotions in a slightly better arena, right? Like working with anger in the ski mountains as a tool certainly helps me feel different about anger when it shows up, in a conversation with my wife, right? Because I'm like, oh, here's that emotion. And instead of like owning me, I can remember it's a tool that provides energy, and that's its purpose in the body anyways.
There's a couple points I want to build off of what Stephen's talking about. First, this idea of anger and fear as energy. This is very true, but it's got a short lifespan. And if you don't get out of the fear and out of the anger really quickly, then you're actually weakening yourself. You're going to debilitate your performance. And so I've actually had kind of peers of mine like claim that, anger is a really, really positive and powerful kind of motivator. And I'm like, it maybe just to get off the X, right? And Navy SEAL speak, that means get the heck out of the ambush. Anger works really well for that. Mm-hmm. But the longer you keep that energy in your system, the more debilitated you're going to be, and the more you're going to weaken your performance. So you got to get past the anger, past the fear, and into a more relaxed state of, and I even would equate it to play, where now you're actually back in your zone of comfort. You are moving and communicating because you've trained to do this in a calm manner, right? So this relates to my second point is, if you train and practice, and they're different things. If you train and practice effectively, you'll never get to a 5 in fear right off the bat. You'll never get there in a performance, because what you're doing is you crawl, and in the crawl phase, you're facing the fears, like I said, in those small bites, and you're finding the courage, and you're recontextualizing, and you're training your body mind system to deal with that, to find flow and to find a balance while in that performance act. And then you move on until the walk stage, where you're doing it more complicated things. And so now on the walk stage, what would have been a 7 or 8 on the fear in the crawl stage is now felt as a 1 or a 2, right? And so you keep the fear and the energy of that well below a threshold where it's debilitating, by training and practicing at a level that is appropriate for your skills, right? And now, of course, I'm not going to ask Steve to define flow, but we know from Shishmahal that it's, you're performing, just above your capacity or your skill level. And so you're in another sense, you're right 1 inch over the edge of your comfort zone. And so by staying that close to the edge, right, that's a micro movement beyond your comfort zone, which is essentially developing a new capacity, both to face that which you fear, as well as to develop the skills to be able to perform that gracefully the next time you're at that level.
Before we get into forgiveness and maybe a little bit more as emotion as tools, how do you differentiate fear that is a useful signal, as in the gift of fear, versus when something is actually wrong, something that needs to be overcome to move forward?
I'll take one swing at it,
Okay.
so The Gift of Fear is a book about intuition. And what science can tell us, and understand when I say science can, this is just what we know. I don't think science has the full answer. This is just what science can tell us. I'm not making blanking statements about the truth. This is what we learned and there's really cool reasons. We've been working a lot, we at the Flow Research Collective have been working a lot on the neurobiology of intuition, what happens in the brain and the body during intuition. And part of that we know in flow, intuition is louder and clearer, less subject to bias. Same thing is true with meditation and certain other things, right? You can clear up intuition. We also know that instinct clouds intuition. So they often say, if the thing that you're trying to get a signal on is involving basic needs, survival, procreation, right? If you're the guy in the bar who's saying to himself, "Oh, I've got an intuition about how this woman feels about me," be doubtful. Don't trust it, because that's a basic driver, and that what we know is instinct clouds intuition fairly frequently, which means fear, right? Survival fear can cloud intuition. And I spent in the Gnar Country adventure, the hardest thing I had to do, I made a rule for myself that I never wanted to perform if I was feeling too much fear, right? Because then it actually starts to hinder performance. It's an easy way to go to the hospital. Now, what is the line between fear and too much fear is really a complicated interoception problem. There are obvious things, right? If your thoughts are spiraling, if you're getting any of those OCD tight circle thoughts, that's always a symbol that a sign that you've got too much norepinephrine in your system. If it's interfering with muscle fluidity, those are really obvious things that you can look for and say, "Oh no, I want to back off. This is detrimental, not positive." But it's a fine line, and I have gotten pretty good at figuring out where it is, but what I've noticed is, like, I can figure out where it is, and I'm really good at it when I'm fully energized. As my body starts to wear down and I get more tired, that line gets fuzzier and it's harder to see exactly where I am. I'd love to hear what Mark thinks about, like, how he finds that point, because that to me is one of, like, the ongoing sort of puzzles of, like, when you're trying to push on athletic performance, especially physical performance, the line between fear and too much fear and where it is and how to figure out when do you back off and when do you go forward is one of the, like, really mature, interesting puzzles, I think.
Agreed. What do you think, Mark?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to address intuition, because I do agree with Stephen. It is nuanced, and there really isn't great understanding about it from the scientific or academic side. But through experience,
That's coming.
It's coming. Well, everything's coming.
We're working on it.
Again, I am not an academic, or I don't approach my work from. I support it or validate it, right? This is why we're having this conversation. I really respect academics and people who do the deep research, but I'm always a study of N=1. I eat my own dog food. I do this work, and so I've learned certain things. And then I also I say the same thing to our unbeatable community. Be a study of N=1. Prove it. Don't listen to a word I say, or don't take a word I say for absolute truth until you prove it for yourself. So what we have learned is that this idea of intuition is very, very tricky for folks who haven't done physical, mental, and emotional development, right? You're just getting all sorts of mixed signals. You have all sorts of cognitive bias and what I call background of obviousness, which are patterning your behavior and your thinking. And so you could have a pattern show up and you'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's an intuition." No, it's not. It's a grouped pattern that maybe hasn't shown up in a while, or shows up every time this happens and you're mistaking it. So that's a bias or a cognitive pattern. You also have, like Stephen mentioned, instinctual. So your gut mind, right? So we know now, of course, that the biome, the gut, the heart are both part of your brain. In fact, your entire body is part of your brain. You can't look at your brain as just in your head. The body is your brain. It's a walking brain, it just has different ways. So there's three key brain centers: the head, right? Where we usually think of the brain; the heart, which has neurological processing capacity and neurons, as well as the gut. The gut is the source of instinctual information, and Steve was pointing that out. So you can have an instinctual information. Generally, it's your biome telling you to move away from danger or to move towards something which is beneficial, like, procreation and keeping the human race alive. Generally, those two things. So you're going to feel real instinctual fear if there's an existential threat, and you're going to feel real instinctual drive to procreate and to do other things, to eat if you're hungry and those kinds of things. That's an instinct. Really not the same as intuition, but it's valuable, certainly, especially if there is a real fear, a real threat, I mean. So at the same time, let me get back to the original point. If your body is untrained, meaning you're overweight or you're sedentary or you haven't learned to move the energy in your body, then you're not going to be able to discern these messages very well. You're going to mistake the messages of your bias and your background of biases patterns, and you're going to mistake the messages of your biome. You're either not going to feel them because your body doesn't have the sensitivity to feel them, or you're going to mistake it. The heart center, the heart brain, really is, like I mentioned before, it's a wisdom center, and it's your source of empathic intuition. It's a relational intuition. And so we know this, of course, when you're in a relationship with an individual who is shut down or projecting some sort of negative energy toward you or judgment toward you, you feel that in the heart region. And you can, the heart has the capacity to experience and project energy far farther than the brain does, because the brain is locked in this little brain housing group called the skull. And so, but the same thing holds true. If you haven't physically trained your body and brought it back into homeostatic balance, which is also training the heart and the head brain, then you're going to be very, very challenged to be able to experience the full capacity of what the heart is trying to tell you. And then the head itself, right? The intuition that you receive from your head, which comes from generally the sixth chakra region, is called insight. And it's a directly perceiving of information that you haven't studied, that you don't know as knowledge. And so that'd be like those aha moments, those sudden paradigm shifts. And one way to look at that is, oh, well, the information was in there, and suddenly, my right brain is been able to recognize the pattern and put the matrix together, and all of a sudden I understand it. There's some truth to that, but there is also something else, and it's just a direct perception. It's called transrational knowledge, or transrational knowing. And this is another form of intuition. But if you haven't trained your brain to have the stillness to be able to perceive that, then you're going to miss those as well. So this all goes back to back to the idea that in order to optimize the experience, so we can have the great benefit and joy of this rich intuitional life, instinctual intuition, empathic intuition, and also insightful intuition, we've got to train the body, we got to train the mind, and we got to clear up the shadow or do the emotional work, because that's what brings the whole system together to be able to allow those messages and that information to be discerned and made sense of.
So let's get into the forgiveness piece. So you've been alluding to it a little bit, Mark. Can you start by just, how does forgiveness play a role in courage, in development, in lifelong learning? What does this mean to you?
I think it's a master key. And what I mean by that is it's difficult to get to forgiveness, but once you find that key, then it unlocks a rich expanse of opportunity that is nothing but courage, because forgiveness is the key to that heart that we're talking about. So anytime that you're holding on to regret or grudge, in particular to yourself, right, then that you're locking up energy, and that's energy that you could use toward positive and productive things. We are ultimately at our very fundamental level just energy. We know that, right? So energy is organized in a very intelligent manner into these cells and into these organs and into this whole entire body-mind system. But ultimately, it's energy. And so, and the mind is the conductor, is the executive. The brain mind is the executive and director of that energy system. Yet it remains unaware a lot of times of how things get locked up, how energy gets locked up. It gets locked up when, at a young age, something happens to you that causes you to feel less safe or emotionally at risk. And yet you don't have the mental or cognitive capacity to really contextualize it properly or to formulate an appropriate response. And so instead, what you do is you kind of splice off that little part and you hide it, you tuck it away somewhere, and then you learn to respond in a defensive way, right? And so this happens all throughout our childhood, right, in the formative years. And there's a saying in the psychology profession that the first 5 years of your life define the next 95. And so the power of the formative years to shape your future cannot be, misrepresented. It formulates pretty much, it's the foundation for everything, all that, conditioning of the early years. So then this isn't the only place you need to forgive, but it's really a good place to start, because that's where the deepest work and the deepest benefits will be found. The deepest veins of gold will be there. But it's hard to start there, right? And so what I often recommend is just start out with, the things that are kind of easy in your life or easier to let go of and to surrender to the fact that it just happened, and then to allow forgiveness to really, it's not something you do, it's something you allow. Right? Again, this idea of these energies are best worked with from the state of full embodied beingness as opposed to an intellectual exercise of doing something, right? So for instance, if we all have communication challenges, right? There's not one world that we live in out here. There's 8 billion worlds being created every day when people open their eyes. And we assume that that's one common world, and it's not. So every time you interact with another human being, you're interacting with a different world. And you're not going to have perfect understanding. It takes a long time to get to understanding, and you never get to perfect understanding, because there's two different worlds there operating. And so what this means is that you're going to say things and you're going to do things that completely conflict with another human being view of reality. And that's going to turn into a hurt, either for them or for you, or some sort of form of regret. Like, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I'd been more graceful or more thoughtful. So we develop the same thing of way we develop courage in some sort of gnarly physical thing. This is the gnarly emotional work. It's like we suck it up and we move toward that, and we have the conversation, right? We have that crucial conversation. We say, listen, I said something that I wish I had been a little bit more thoughtful, and I'd like to apologize for that. And then and either get an acceptance of that apology or not. It doesn't really matter. And if it's too scary to do this in person, then just do it in your head, right? Just start there. But let go. This is the whole practice of surrender. Let go. Surrender to that incident. It happened. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's just that the totality of all events in your world and in that person's world at that moment, an infinite number of causes led to that thing happening. So it just happened. So stop taking ownership of it and forgive yourself, right? So we call this practice recapitulation. It came from the ancient Toltecs. So the Toltec warriors, until they were accepted into the warrior class, had to recapitulate their entire life from that moment all the way back to birth. And that meant in their mind, with their visualization, with an open heart, they had to go back and relive every single day and find out where they screwed up, where they were holding on to regret or negative energy or some sort of hurt or trauma, and they had to forgive. And what this did is it led to an absolute clearing of their whole energy system, all the way back to childhood, all the traumas, everything, so that as a warrior, they could proceed into battle with a clear mind and open heart, and be spontaneous and effective, and not be acting out as some stuck energy or some anger or fear or revenge, right? Those types of energies, which we often see being played out.
I love that you're calling it the gnarly emotional work. Because in the book, Stephen, you talk about if we want to attain peak performance at any age, we have to deal with personal forgiveness and traumas of the past. And you mentioned throughout the book your dirty old shame, and you talk about how you conquered it. So can you tell us a little bit about that piece of the book?
Well, I mean, we talked a little about it earlier. From a peak performance aging standpoint, as I said, there are really beneficial changes in the brain as we enter our 50s. You gain access to whole new levels of developmental intelligence, new levels of creativity, wisdom, and empathy. But you cannot, if you haven't there's an adult development gateway around 50. And by then, if you haven't forgiven yourself and others, all of these sort of cognitive superpowers that become yours and really sort of help you sort of defend against the ravages of time, the stuff that's going to change in your brain, right? This is beneficial stuff that can counteract some of the negative things that can happen in the brain over time. But if you haven't forgiven yourself and others, you actually it doesn't work that way. And you don't get the benefits, right? Without forgiveness, the empathy can't develop, the wisdom can't develop, and developmental intelligence, a large portion of it is the ability to see things from multiple perspectives. And without forgiveness, right, you get stuck in I'm right, and blocks out a lot of other stuff. So from that perspective, it's there. And what I think is so interesting about it, because forgiveness is one of these really amorphous things that, like, how do you do it? How do you know if you're there? What are we measuring? What are we looking at? And what I find really interesting is there's so much research on compassion meditation, loving kindness meditation. And we know that, even 2 weeks worth of compassion meditation, 6 weeks, starts to have big impacts on the temporal parietal junction, which is the part of the brain where forgiveness shows up or not. It's the part of our brain that allows us, it's perspective. So whether it's physical perspective, I'm looking this way, or psychological perspective or emotional perspective, it's this part of the brain. And there's lots of work saying, just running the loving kindness meditation is essentially a script, right? It's a pre-done script that you try to like run the script. And as Mark says, you want to have a somatic experience, an embodied experience. So like you're running a script and trying to get access to these feelings at the same time. And that's what ends up kind of rewiring the brain. So what's interesting to me about forgiveness is it seems like this super hard amorphous thing. And how do I do it? And how do I know if I'm there? But we know from a science perspective that if you're practicing loving kindness meditation, it sort of takes care of itself. I think there will be large hurdles, like, my issue with the jocks, where, you might need a bigger tool, but it's a great place to start. And the other thing is, if we know that, as Mark talked about, as I've talked about, forgiveness unlocks a lot of stuff. And all you have to do is run a script that takes 11 minutes. Like I use the University of New Hampshire's Loving Kindness Meditate, their script. I like it the best. You can find it on YouTube. A lot of other people have different versions, but I like it the most. It's very non-denominational. It's it's just sort of a clean, cool, emotional script, but it takes about 11 minutes. So that's not a whole lot of time, and you get so much benefit from it. So it seems like this big, thick thing, forgiveness, and Mark is right? This is sort of a gnarly emotion that we have to deal with, but the tools we have to dealing with it, at least in the beginning, are pretty straightforward, which is kind of cool.
It's really important work, I think, especially for the men listening, right? You think that a lot of people, push back against this emotional work. It seems kind of soft and gooey, and it's not for them, right? They think that mental toughness, resiliency is about being hard. When we train Navy SEALs, we often ask them in the thick of things and say, okay, there's a freaking massive storm coming here. Do you want to be the mighty oak, or would you like to be the reed that can kind of just kind of bend over and let that storm and the tsunami wave kind of wash over you and then sprout right back up? Whereas that mighty oak is going to get swept away. And so forgiveness is like the yin of the yang of mental toughness and resiliency. Right? You can't just have all the hard and think, well, I'm going to toughen up. I'm going to push through this. I'm going to learn mental toughness. I'm going to face down my fears. I'm going to learn how to be disciplined. I'm going to drive every day. Because eventually it's like, I love my teammate, David Goggins, but, I'm wondering, like, he's running toward a wall at one speed. Eventually, he's going to hit that wall and go splat. Where's the yin? Where's the soft, receptive, adaptive, compassionate, and authentic energy going to come from if you don't practice it, if you don't open up to it, if you don't surrender to it? And most guys in our Western world, they don't go there because it just, for a lot of reasons, right? It's scary work. The staunch individual cowboy mentality still permeates, our culture. And also there's a lot of shame around thinking that you're not the strong person, the capable, the worthy one, right? So I'm here to tell you, and Stephen's telling you, that get over it, right? That's exactly where you need to go, right? We have a massive bias toward action and hard already in our society. So let's develop an equal bias toward the soft receptivity of compassion and forgiveness and acceptance. And another way we kind of teach mental toughness is like, hey, guess what? If you are projecting negative energy on another individual, and I'm talking about a SEAL gets pissed at a teammate, or who's full of fear and about ready to quit. So you're projecting that out onto your team. So your judgment is, and all that energy you're putting out is just literally leaving a carbon copy on yourself. So if you are judging someone and you're stuck in regret and resentment and the energy of, like, someone did this to me and I'm pissed and I'll never forgive them, then you are leaving a carbon copy of that on yourself. You're the one that is experiencing that hurt, and you're locking that hurt up in yourself, right? They're not experiencing anything except maybe that you don't like them, or that they're closed off. So all you're doing with forgiveness work is essentially being nice to yourself and treating yourself well and developing that compassion and that openness and that experience of being worthy and whole again. And that has incredible benefits, not just for performance, not just for aging, but in aging gracefully. And for me, that means to be absolutely content with who you are, where you are, and why you're on this planet. It's like those ephemeral, like, what is the meaning of having lived a good life and true success? It's not your bank account, right? It's not how successful your business was, but it's this feeling of peace, the peace that passeth all understanding, that is accessible to everybody. And that feels like contentment, compassion, just presence, okay with being just who you are, why you are, and where you are, without grasping, right?
Mm-hmm.
So forgiveness is really the master key to finding that level of grace in life.
I think that's an immensely, immensely helpful frame. I mean, I work with high performing, hard charging people all the time. And it's making me think of, we talk about the importance of grit. And these are people who, the grit to endure, persist, grind, no problem, have it in spades. But the grit to recover, to know when to dial back, to unplug, that's the real opportunity. That's the harder work. And what I'm hearing both of you say is that, approaching fear and doing the hard things and maybe throwing yourself, outside of your comfort zone, that might be the easier work. The harder work really might be the emotional work, the forgiveness piece, but it's this incredibly important unlocking move. And Stephen, you're talking about, it's an unlocking move to access many of the superpowers of aging. So I thought you segued me nicely. I wanted to close out our conversation today by asking both of you, what superpowers have you noticed emerge in your own lives as you've gotten older? And just maybe a quick note on how you think that might have supported your success, particularly in business.
Well, I'll go, because Stephen can finish up, since he's probably got a lot more to say on this than I do, and it's his platform. But I feel like I'm just getting warmed up, right? And Stephen, maybe you have a similar sense. Like, there's a point where suddenly, because of the tension the intention to be whole leads to attention placed in how do I become whole? How do I optimize myself? And we use different words, right? But really we're trying to get to the same thing. How do we become the best version of ourselves and live a meaningful life? And so when we have that intention and we become growth mindset people, and we relentlessly are seekers of that, then we put our attention on how does that work, right? And so more and more people are finding Flow Research Collective or Unbeatable Mind, and they're finding a path, which has been very, very lacking in Western society, is a path of integration toward wholeness with coaches like Tori and like our Unbeatable Mind and Navy SEAL coaches who have walked that path and say, okay, here's a way, follow me, and I'll help you kind of carve your own path, because there's no one path. There's literally an infinite number of individual paths. But to follow a path, this is what we mean by mastery. What are we talking about when we talk about mastery? It's to follow a path toward becoming more whole, right? And then that's experienced as peak and optimal performance, experienced as heart opening and more compassion, experienced as greater perspective, more inclusiveness, right? Better communication skills, greater vision, more alignment with that sense of purpose, which gives you much more power, grit, resilience, all that kind of stuff. So there's just different words to describe this experiences.
Yeah. So
finding that path is critical. And then on that path, when you come to qualified teachers who really have been there, done that, like Stephen, myself, and others, we're teaching that path to wholeness needs to be done in an integrated manner, right? Whereas in the past, the Western, first, there was no path. Secondly, everything was disjointed and separated. You went to the gym to work on your body over here. Your whole spiritual life was in church on Sundays or wrapped up in some religious dogma of your family. And emotional work was not even spoken of, especially for men. And so we ended up staying as separate, dysfunctional, disjointed kind of human beings. And we get to our middle age in the 50s or so, and we just start to feel like we've missed something big.
Yeah.
Okay, so the earlier in your life that you can get on these paths to wholeness, to integrated development, then the more accelerated the growth will be. But it doesn't matter what age you start, you're going to find great benefit, right? You're going to find great benefit. So develop yourself through a daily practice of physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual training or practice, which leads to more wholeness. And also then you go out and you challenge yourself. We use the crucible metaphor, right? Which is our version of gnarly. So when we have training at SEALFIT, which is like, come test yourself in 12, 24 hour, 50 hours of nonstop, gnarly physical, mental, emotional team training. And what that does is it radically focuses you to get serious about your growth by learning something new and by challenging yourself in ways that you would never normally challenge yourself. And so then there's a transcend and include moment, like you spiral out of those challenging moments, challenging events with even greater awareness and perspective and growth. Right? And so we get unstuck and we accelerate the growth even further by taking on those big challenges. All of this is leading where? It's leading to just this experience of, okay, here we are. We're just getting warmed up at 60 years old. The future is just this massive, creative outlet. It's like a blank slate, tabula rasa, and we get to open our eyes, and instead of us waking into a dangerous world, we open our eyes and the world awakens to us, and we get to create it. We're like the pen on a blank sheet of paper. We get to create our reality, and this is the absolute truth. We get to create a reality, and we do it just one day at a time. And that's, my saying, one day, one lifetime, which I got from Nakamura, my Zen teacher. Every day is an opportunity, right, to find yourself, to find your wholeness. Like the Buddha says, you can find enlightenment in a single breath if you pay close enough attention. Today's your opportunity to do that. So take it seriously. Train your body, train your mind, train your spirit. Be whole, be present, be compassionate, be forgiving. And guess what? That's probably a good idea, because you don't know if there's going to be a tomorrow for you. This
Truly.
is the warrior's path, right? You just don't know. So bring it today.
Incredible advice. I love that. Rick. What about you, Stephen?
What was the question? I was listening to Mark.
Just got lost.
I'm kidding.
Were you taking notes?
I forgot the question.
Yeah,
We're in flow. It's fine.
I know I agree with so whatever it is, to me, learning, progression, mastery, all the things that come with that. I think those are the things, especially when they're like long, hard challenges that you're getting like learning and progression and mastery through. Those are the things that make life much more meaningful. And I just feel like the older I get, I haven't stopped progressing at all the things I wanted to progress at. I'm a better athlete at 55 than I was at 18. I'm a much better thinker, writer, husband, friend, all those things. I'm better at the things that seem to be most important to me. And yet I still don't feel like I'm good at any of that. I'm better. I'm a hell of a lot better than I've been, but like sort of master, where like I'm not done yet. And so but what I think is different now is I finally feel like I'm playing at the level I want to play at. So I don't necessarily know if I'm ever going to get to where I want to go, or if that's a good thing. I don't mind it. But what I found is that the older you get, as long as if it's an inch at a time every day, and when you've been doing that for 20 years or 30 years, oddly, today's inch matters more rather than less, and means more rather than less. And like, you'd think that after 20 years of doing something, it would get thinner or weaker, and it actually goes the opposite direction. I don't know if that's very clear. Maybe they call this wisdom, and I don't yet know. But that's what I think is more interesting. I respect and appreciate and go after the progression more, not less, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. Over those years. So here's another metaphor, right? The last step you take to reach the pinnacle of Everest is just as important as the first step. Or said another way, the first step is as important as the last. Each step is crucial, and they're linked in this long chain, right? But you have greater perspective with the last step, so you can appreciate it more. So what I like to do is try to take an inverse, flip everything upside down, develop that same level of respect and appreciation for the first step and the second step, and keep that last step in mind, right? So keep the vision of where you're going in mind, and know that it's going to happen, and bring that present focus to this next step. Right. And that way we can have the motivation and, the grace to just bring 100% to everything we do every day.
I think that's an incredibly strong way for us to end. Look, gentlemen, we promised folks an amazing conversation. I think we've delivered that and then some today. This was awesome. I'm fired up. This was incredible. And I really appreciate both of you taking the time to allow all of us to join you for this one. This was amazing.
It's been an honor. Thank you, Stephen.
It's been a tremendous amount of fun. Thank you, Tori. Thank you, Mark.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.